The courtroom went quiet the moment I stood up, and that's when I knew this was the moment everything would change. I could hear my own breathing, slow but heavy, as if the air itself had thickened around me. The wooden bench beneath my palms felt cold, unfamiliar, nothing like the kitchen chair I had sat in for years, sipping coffee across from the man I once called my husband. Across the room, she sat there, legs crossed, chin lifted, black dress pressed just right, wearing grief like a costume she'd practiced in front of a mirror. The mistress. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. She thought she'd already won. The judge cleared his throat. Papers shuffled. Somewhere behind me, someone coughed, the sound echoing louder than it should have. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Are you ready?" I nodded, because I had been ready for a long time. Before all of this, before court dates and whispered condolences and people choosing sides, I lived a life that felt ordinary in the best way, predictable, steady. My husband, Harold, and I had been married for 32 years. We met young, built a home brick by brick, argument by argument, forgiveness by forgiveness. We weren't perfect, but we were us. Every morning, Harold woke before me. I'd hear the floor creak softly as he shuffled to the kitchen, always careful not to wake me, though he never succeeded. The smell of toast, slightly burnt every time, would drift down the hallway. He liked it that way, said it reminded him of his mother. I worked part-time at the library. He handled the finances. That was our arrangement, one I trusted without question. On Sundays, we sat on the porch in the late afternoon, iced tea sweating in our hands, watching the neighborhood slow down. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. Silence never scared us. Looking back, that's what hurts the most, how safe I felt. The first crack was so small I almost missed it. Harold started guarding his phone, not dramatically, just little things. Turning the screen down when I walked in, stepping outside to take calls, smiling at messages he never shared. When I asked who it was, he'd shrug and say, "Work stuff." I wanted to believe him. 32 years earned you a kind of trust that doesn't vanish overnight. Then there were the late nights, the sudden meetings, the cologne he hadn't worn since our 10th anniversary. Still, I told myself stories that kept the peace in my own heart. Men change, life gets busy, don't go borrowing trouble. The day everything shifted, it wasn't a big discovery, no lipstick on collars, no dramatic confrontation. It was a bank statement. I was organizing paperwork, something I'd put off for too long, when I noticed withdrawals I didn't recognize, large ones, repeated. I remember running my finger down the page, feeling my chest tighten with every line. When I asked Harold about it, his answer came too fast. "Investments," he said. "I told you." He hadn't, but I nodded anyway. That was the beginning of my silence, not because I was weak, but because I was watching. The truth came out the way it often does, not all at once, but in pieces that cut deeper each time. A woman from his office called the house one afternoon, her voice too familiar, asking for him by a nickname I had never used. Another time I saw them together, not holding hands, just standing too close, sharing a look that belonged to history. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said, "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." He told me it was over. He told me I was still his wife. He told me what men always tell women when they want forgiveness without consequences. I stayed, not because I didn't feel the betrayal, but because I believed time and truth would sort it out. Then Harold got sick. Cancer doesn't care about unfinished conversations or broken trust. It moves fast and quiet, leaving you breathless and unprepared. Suddenly, I was his caregiver, his advocate, the woman holding his hand through chemo, through nights filled with pain and fear. She disappeared during that time, or so I thought. When Harold passed, the grief was physical, heavy. It settled into my bones. People brought casseroles. They hugged me too tightly. They told me how strong I was. And then she showed up at the funeral, standing in the back, dressed in black, crying just enough to be seen. That's when I realized this wasn't over. The will reading came weeks later. I sat in that lawyer's office, hands folded in my lap, heart steady in a way that surprised even me. I expected confusion, maybe some arguments. What I didn't expect was to be told I'd been left almost nothing. The house, the accounts, the majority of the estate, all to her. She smiled then, just briefly, like a secret between us. I didn't say a word, because what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Harold had come to me months before he died, weak, afraid, honest in a way he hadn't been in years. "I need to fix something," he'd said. And I listened. That memory stayed with me as I stood in that courtroom now, the weight of paper resting in my bag like a promise kept. The judge looked up. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have something you'd like to present?" I did. I always had. And as I reached into my bag, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The judge's question echoed in my ears longer than it should have, as if the room itself was waiting to see whether I would shrink back into my seat or step fully into the truth. I closed my bag slowly, not yet pulling anything out. There was time. I had learned patience the hard way. Before I could tell you how I ended up standing in that courtroom with my heart steady and my hands calm, I need to take you back to the life that existed before suspicion, before betrayal, before wills and lawyers and whispers. Harold and I met when I was 22. I worked at a diner then, balancing plates on my arms and dreams in my head. He used to come in every Thursday morning, order black coffee and eggs, and leave $1 folded neatly under the saucer. He wasn't flashy. He listened more than he spoke. When he asked me out, it wasn't with confidence. It was with hope. Our marriage was built on routines: grocery shopping every Saturday morning, church on Sundays, movie nights where we both fell asleep halfway through. He liked order. I liked warmth. Together, we made something that worked. When we finally bought our house, I remember standing in the empty living room, the smell of fresh paint still sharp in the air. Harold wrapped his arms around me from behind and said, "This is ours." And for years, it truly felt that way. I handled the home, he handled the money. It wasn't control, it was trust. I never questioned it. Why would I? Bills were paid, savings grew, we talked about retirement like it was a shared dream. That's why the shift felt so disorienting when it came. At first, it was small changes. Harold became distracted, distant in a way I couldn't quite name. He laughed at his phone. He grew impatient when I asked questions. When I reached for him in bed, he sometimes flinched, just slightly, like his mind was somewhere else. Still, I didn't accuse him. I asked how he was feeling. I cooked his favorite meals. I told myself this was a phase. Men his age went through things. Midlife wasn't kind. The woman, her, entered our lives quietly. She worked in his office. I learned her name only later. At the time, she was just a coworker, someone he mentioned casually over dinner, the way you mention weather or traffic. I noticed how often her name came up, how his voice softened around it. That should have been my warning. But love has a way of dulling instinct. The first time I truly felt unsettled was when I found a receipt in his coat pocket. A restaurant I'd never been to. 2 meals, 2 glasses of wine. I asked him about it. He shrugged. "Client dinner," he said. His eyes didn't meet mine. That night I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan click an uneven rhythm, wondering when my marriage had started to feel like something I was watching from the outside. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't explode. It seeped. I overheard a phone call, his voice low, intimate, nothing like the man who spoke to me these days. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall for balance. He said, "I miss you." Those 2 words were louder than any confession. When I confronted him, he didn't yell, he didn't deny it. He sat down at the kitchen table, folded his hands, and told me the truth in pieces, careful, measured, like he was trying not to hurt me more than necessary. He said, "She understands me. She listens." I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me, absurdly loud in that moment. I remember thinking, I've been listening for 32 years. I could have left then, maybe I should have, but marriage is more than moments. It's history, fear, hope, and habit all tangled together. He promised it was over, promised he chose me, and I believed him. Then came the diagnosis. Cancer has a way of rearranging priorities overnight. Suddenly, the affair felt smaller than survival. I went into caregiver mode without hesitation. Appointments, medications, sleepless nights. I watched his body weaken and his confidence fade. During that time, she vanished, or so it seemed. I thought perhaps shame had finally found its way to her. I was wrong. After Harold passed, when grief was still fresh and raw, she appeared at the funeral. Standing at a distance, her eyes red, her posture practiced. People whispered. Some recognized her, others didn't. I said nothing. Grief teaches restraint. The lawyer's office was where the real betrayal landed. Sitting across from polished wood and polite voices, I learned that accounts had been changed, beneficiaries reassigned, assets promised elsewhere. I felt something inside me go still. When the lawyer finished reading, he looked at me with something like sympathy. He said, "I'm sorry." Across the room, she daubed at her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. Her mouth curved just slightly upward when she thought no one was watching. I went home that day and sat in my living room until the light faded. I touched the arms of the couch Harold and I picked out together. I looked at the walls that held decades of laughter and arguments and forgiveness. And then I remembered something. Months before Harold died, during one of his clearer moments, he asked me to bring him a folder from the study. His voice was thin, his hand shook. He said, "There's something I need to make right." That night he told me everything, about the guilt, about the changes he'd made under pressure, about the fear of dying having already done too much damage. He whispered, "I signed another will, the real one. It's with someone I trust." He named the attorney. He asked me to promise something. "Don't fight loudly," he said. "Just fight right." I kept that promise. So when I sat in that courtroom now, listening to the judge, watching her confidence fill the room, I wasn't afraid, because I wasn't reacting. I was revealing. I finally reached into my bag, and this time I pulled out the truth. The sound of paper sliding against leather echoed louder than it should have when I finally lifted the document from my bag. My fingers brushed the edges first, slow and deliberate, as if I were reminding myself that this was real, that I hadn't imagined those late-night conversations, that Harold's last clear moments had meant something. The judge raised an eyebrow. The room leaned forward. "This," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "is a later will." A murmur moved through the courtroom like a ripple through water. I didn't look at her, not yet. I kept my eyes on the bench, on the man whose job it was to weigh truth against performance. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Counsel?" Her attorney was already standing, objection forming on his lips. "Your Honor, this document has not been—" "I know," the judge said calmly. "That's why we're here. Please proceed." I walked the document forward myself. Each step felt heavy, not with fear, but with memory. The hallway smell of antiseptic from the hospice, Harold's breath rattling when he slept, the way his hand had tightened around mine when he made me promise. The clerk took the will.
The judge read in silence, his expression unreadable. Time stretched. Somewhere behind me, someone coughed, a chair creaked. Then I heard it, a sharp intake of breath. Not mine, hers. I turned then. For the first time since the hearing began, I looked directly at the woman who had believed she'd won. Her face had gone pale, the confidence draining from it like color from old fabric. Her lips parted, and for a moment she looked small, not triumphant, not grieving, just caught. "This will," the judge said slowly, "is dated 3 months after the previous document." Her attorney shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, we were not made aware of—" "That's not the issue. The issue is validity." I sat back down, my knees weak now that the moment had arrived. This was the part I couldn't control anymore. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. As the legal arguments unfolded, my mind wandered, not away, but inward. I remembered the first time I realized how deep their relationship had gone. It wasn't the phone calls or the late nights. It was the way she'd moved into my life without permission, how she'd learned our routines, how she'd shown up at the hospital once, claiming she was just checking on a friend. I had stood there, holding a cup of bad coffee, watching her place a hand on my husband's arm like it belonged there. Harold had looked away, shame flickering across his face. That was when something hardened inside me, not into anger, but into clarity. She hadn't just loved him. She had replaced me. When the judge finally called for a recess, I stepped into the hallway alone. My legs trembled. I leaned against the cool marble wall and closed my eyes. I didn't cry. I thought about the woman I had been at 22, balancing plates and dreaming big. I thought about the years I had poured into a life that now felt like it was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who hadn't earned it. Footsteps approached. I opened my eyes. It was her. Up close, I could see the cracks in her composure, the mascara smudged beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She hesitated, then spoke. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. I suspected, then I knew. She laughed, short and brittle. "He told you you were weak, that you'd never fight." I met her gaze. He was wrong. Her face tightened. "He loved me." "I know," I said softly, "but he also loved his conscience. In the end, that mattered more." She shook her head, anger rising. "You think this makes you better than me?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No, I think it makes me honest." The bailiff called us back in. When the session resumed, the judge addressed the room with quiet authority. The later will had been notarized, witnessed, filed correctly. It named me as the primary beneficiary, restored the house, the accounts, the savings we had built together. The earlier will, the one that had favored her, was ruled superseded. She stared straight ahead as the decision was read, her hands clenched in her lap. No tears this time, just disbelief. Justice, I learned that day, isn't loud. It doesn't gloat. It settles. Afterward, family members approached me, some apologetic, some ashamed. They had believed the story they'd been told, that I was bitter, that I was holding on, that I didn't know when to let go. None of them had known about the nights Harold and I spent talking quietly about regret and repair, about the mornings he woke up frightened of dying without setting things right. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. As I left the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. I paused at the steps, breathing in deeply, feeling something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Peace. Not happiness, not victory. Peace. That night, I went home to the house that was mine again. I walked through each room slowly, touching the door frames, the window sills. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table where so many hard conversations had happened. I thought about her, what she would do next, where she would go. I didn't wish her harm, I wished her distance. Some losses are lessons disguised as punishment. Before bed, I opened the drawer where I kept the real will, now returned to me. I ran my thumb over Harold's signature, steady despite everything. He had made mistakes, but he had also made amends, and that mattered. In the weeks after the court ruling, silence settled into my life like dust after a storm. Not the peaceful kind at first. This was the awkward, echoing quiet that comes when something loud and painful finally stops moving. I woke up each morning half expecting my phone to buzz with another accusation, another demand, another reminder of what had almost been taken from me. But it didn't. Instead, there were small sounds again, ordinary ones, the kettle clicking off, the floorboards creaking as I walked from room to room, the distant hum of traffic outside my window, sounds that reminded me I was still here, still standing, still capable of filling my days with something other than defense. I returned to routine slowly. I watered the plants Harold used to forget about. I reorganized the hall closet, finding old scarves and mismatched gloves that smelled faintly of cedar. I cooked meals just for myself, relearning portions, relearning appetite. Grief has a way of confusing hunger. You don't know whether you're starving or numb. One afternoon, as I folded laundry, I found one of his shirts tucked behind the dryer. Blue, soft from years of washing. I pressed it to my face before I could stop myself. The scent was faint now, almost gone, but memory filled in the rest. I tried, I whispered to the empty room. I wasn't sure if I meant him or myself. The calls started about a month later. At first, they came from family. Distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly found my number again. Some wanted details, others wanted reassurance that they hadn't been wrong to stay silent when the rumors were spreading. I didn't know what to believe, my sister-in-law said over the phone one evening, her voice tight with guilt. You believed what was easiest, I replied gently. We all do. Then came the calls from people who had known both of us, neighbors, old friends, former coworkers. They told me how sorry they were, how brave they thought I was, how they never imagined Harold capable of such betrayal. I listened. I nodded. I accepted their words without letting them anchor too deeply. Validation feels good, but it doesn't rebuild a life. One afternoon, I received a letter, no return address. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. I knew who it was before I opened it. She didn't apologize, not really. She wrote about misunderstanding, about promises she thought were real, about how the world had judged her without knowing her heart. I loved him, she wrote, and I lost everything. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I set it aside. Loss, I had learned, does not make us equal. I never responded. What surprised me most wasn't her anger or her grief. It was how little space it took up in me now. The fire I'd carried for so long had burned itself out, leaving behind something steadier. Not forgiveness exactly, but freedom. I began volunteering at the community center on Tuesdays. Nothing dramatic, just helping organize donated clothes, tutoring kids who needed an extra hour of patience after school. There was a woman there named Clara who had lost her husband years before. She never asked about my story. She simply sat beside me during breaks and shared her oranges, peeling them slowly, methodically. "You don't owe anyone your pain," she said once, out of nowhere. "You're allowed to keep some things just for yourself." That sentence stayed with me. One morning, months later, I stood in the courtroom again, not as a defendant or a widow, but as a witness, another woman, another will, another story of trust misused. I sat in the back, hands folded, listening. I realized then how many of us carry quiet truths, waiting for the right moment or the right courage to speak them. Afterward, the woman approached me. She recognized me from my case. "How did you survive it?" she asked. I thought about all the answers I could give her, about strength, about patience, about justice. Instead, I said, "I stopped trying to disappear." Healing didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, in the way I slept through the night again, in the way I laughed, really laughed, when a child at the center told me my handwriting looked like a grandma's but in a good way, in the way my shoulders stopped tensing every time someone mentioned Harold's name. I kept the house, but I changed it. New curtains, a fresh coat of paint in the bedroom. I donated furniture that held too much weight and kept what felt honest. Space, I learned, can hold memory without being trapped by it. On the anniversary of the court decision, I visited the cemetery alone. I brought flowers Harold would have liked, simple ones. I stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing. "I forgive you," I said finally, "but I forgive myself more." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of grass and earth. I felt no response, no sign, and that was okay. Some closures don't come with answers, they come with acceptance. As I walked back to my car, I felt taller somehow, not because I'd won, but because I'd endured without losing myself. People still ask me how I did it, how I faced her in court, how I held on to the truth when everything around me tried to rewrite it. The answer is simple, though it took me a lifetime to learn. I remembered who I was before anyone told me I was nothing, and I refuse to let anyone erase that again.
Life has a way of testing whether you truly meant the words you said in your hardest moments. Saying, "I'm healed," is one thing. Living like you believe it is another. After the court case faded from public memory, after the whispers slowed and the curiosity cooled, I was left with something quieter but heavier. Choice. No one was watching anymore. No one was judging my strength. It was just me, standing in the middle of my own days, deciding what kind of woman I would be next. For a long time, I had been defined by survival, by what I endured, by what I held together when everything tried to fall apart. Strength can become a uniform if you wear it too long. You forget what softness feels like underneath. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the houses across the street, I realized something that startled me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the sharp anger that keeps you awake, not the slow-burning resentment that hardens your voice. It had loosened its grip without asking my permission. In its place was something unfamiliar: space. And space can be frightening. I thought about Harold differently now, not as the man who betrayed me, but as the man who made choices he was too afraid to face while alive. I saw his cowardice more clearly than his cruelty. That didn't excuse him, but it explained him. Understanding doesn't erase pain, but it does shrink it to a size you can carry without breaking your back. One afternoon, I received a call from his daughter, my stepdaughter, though we'd never used that word much. She had stayed quiet through everything, neutral, careful. "I was wrong," she said without greeting. "I should have stood by you." I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the wall. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but regret. "You did what you could," I said, "and I meant it." She came by a week later. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to plan holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays. She looked around, noticing the changes, the lighter walls, the new runner on the floor. "It feels different," she said. "It is. So am I." We talked for hours.
about her childhood, about the father she loved and the man she didn't always understand, about the woman she feared had replaced me and how ashamed she felt for believing that lie. "I thought you were stronger than this," she confessed quietly. "I didn't realize strength could look like standing still." I reached across the table and took her hand. Strength isn't loud, it's consistent. That night, after she left, I cried, not from pain, but from release. Some wounds don't need justice, they need acknowledgement. Weeks turned into months, seasons shifted. I learned to mark time not by anniversaries of loss, but by moments of growth. The first time I traveled alone and didn't feel lonely. The first holiday I spent without dread. The first morning I woke up excited for a day that had no agenda. I began writing again. Nothing fancy, just pages in a notebook by the bed, memories, thoughts, lessons I didn't want to forget. One line kept appearing in different forms. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. I shared my story once at the community center, not the details, just the essence, about standing firm when others expected me to fold, about dignity being something you practice, not something you claim. A woman in the back wiped her eyes, another nodded like she'd been waiting to hear it her whole life. Afterward, someone asked me if I ever wished I had handled things differently. I thought about the fear I felt that day in court, the way my hands shook as I held the will, the quiet resolve that surprised even me. "No," I said, because for the first time I didn't betray myself. That, I learned, is the betrayal that cuts deepest, the one we commit in silence against our own knowing. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about her, the woman who believed she had won. I wonder what her life looks like now, if she's found peace or if she's still chasing validation in places that can't hold it. I don't wish her harm. I don't wish her happiness either. I wish her clarity, because clarity is what finally set me free. The house feels like mine now, not a shared space, not a memory museum. Mine. I open the windows when I want, I play music too loud, I sit in silence without feeling accused by it. I've learned that love should never require you to shrink, to doubt your worth, or to disappear so someone else can shine. If it does, it isn't love. It's control dressed in comfort. I don't tell my story to be admired. I tell it because somewhere, someone is sitting in their own quiet fear, holding a truth they're afraid will cost them everything. And I want them to know this. Sometimes, telling the truth doesn't take everything away. Sometimes, it gives you your life back.
Life has a way of testing whether you truly meant the words you said in your hardest moments. Saying "I'm healed" is one thing. Living like you believe it is another. After the court case faded from public memory, after the whispers slowed and the curiosity cooled, I was left with something quieter but heavier. Choice. No one was watching anymore. No one was judging my strength. It was just me, standing in the middle of my own days, deciding what kind of woman I would be next. For a long time, I had been defined by survival, by what I endured, by what I held together when everything tried to fall apart. Strength can become a uniform if you wear it too long. You forget what softness feels like underneath. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the houses across the street, I realized something that startled me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the sharp anger that keeps you awake, not the slow-burning resentment that hardens your voice. It had loosened its grip without asking my permission. In its place was something unfamiliar. Space. And space can be frightening. I thought about Harold differently now, not as the man who betrayed me, but as the man who made choices he was too afraid to face while alive. I saw his cowardice more clearly than his cruelty. That didn't excuse him, but it explained him. Understanding doesn't erase pain, but it does shrink it to a size you can carry without breaking your back.
One afternoon, I received a call from his daughter, my stepdaughter, though we'd never used that word much. She had stayed quiet through everything, neutral, careful. "I was wrong," she said without greeting. "I should have stood by you." I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the wall. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but regret. "You did what you could," I said, and I meant it. She came by a week later. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to plan holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays. She looked around, noticing the changes, the lighter walls, the new runner on the floor. "It feels different," she said. "It is," I replied. "So am I." We talked for hours about her childhood, about the father she loved and the man she didn't always understand, about the woman she feared had replaced me and how she felt ashamed for believing that lie. "I thought you were stronger than this," she confessed quietly. "I didn't realize strength could look like standing still." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Strength isn't loud," I told her. "It's consistent." That night, after she left, I cried not from pain, but from release. Some wounds don't need justice. They need acknowledgement. Weeks turned into months. Seasons shifted. I learned to mark time not by anniversaries of loss, but by moments of growth. The first time I traveled alone and didn't feel lonely. The first holiday I spent without dread. The first morning I woke up excited for a day that had no agenda. I began writing again. Nothing fancy, just pages in a notebook by the bed. Memories, thoughts, lessons I didn't want to forget. One line kept appearing in different forms. "Truth doesn't need permission to exist." I shared my story once at the community center. Not the details, just the essence, about standing firm when others expected me to fold, about dignity being something you practice, not something you claim. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Another nodded like she'd been waiting to hear it her whole life. Afterward, someone asked me if I ever wished I had handled things differently. I thought about the fear I felt that day in court, the way my hands shook as I held the will, the quiet resolve that surprised even me. "No," I said, because for the first time, I didn't betray myself. That, I learned, is the betrayal that cuts deepest, the one we commit in silence against our own knowing. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about her, the woman who believed she had won. I wonder what her life looks like now, if she's found peace or if she's still chasing validation in places that can't hold it. I don't wish her harm. I don't wish her happiness either. I wish her clarity, because clarity is what finally set me free. The house feels like mine now, not a shared space, not a memory museum, mine. I open the windows when I want. I play music too loud. I sit in silence without feeling accused by it. I've learned that love should never require you to shrink, to doubt your worth, or to disappear so someone else can shine. If it does, it isn't love. It's control dressed up in comfort. I don't tell my story to be admired. I tell it because somewhere, someone is sitting in their own quiet fear, holding a truth they're afraid will cost them everything. And I want them to know this. Sometimes telling the truth doesn't take everything away. Sometimes it gives you your life back. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces so small you don't notice them at first, like dust settling after a door finally closes. In the weeks after the court decision, life didn't suddenly become bright or easy. The phone didn't stop ringing. Distant relatives who hadn't checked on me during my grief suddenly wanted updates, explanations, opinions. Some were kind. Others were curious in that way people get when pain becomes a story they can retell. I learned quickly who was asking out of concern and who was asking for entertainment. So I started choosing quiet. I spent mornings tending the small garden behind the house. The soil still smelt the same as it always had, damp, honest, grounding. I planted herbs I'd neglected for years, basil, rosemary, mint.
Watching something grow without secrets felt like a gift. I rearranged the living room, not because it needed it, but because I did. I moved Harold's old chair closer to the window, not out of sentimentality, but because I wanted the sunlight there. I packed away some of his things and kept others. Healing, I discovered, doesn't mean erasing someone. It means deciding what stays and what no longer belongs in your daily life. The mistress, no, the woman, faded from my thoughts more quickly than I expected. Not because she wasn't part of the damage, but because I refused to let her be part of my future. I didn't need to understand her motives to release her hold on my emotions. Understanding is optional. Peace is not. There were still moments, though, unexpected ones. I'd hear a laugh that sounded like hers in a grocery store aisle or catch a familiar perfume in an elevator. My body would tense before my mind could reason. Trauma has a memory all its own. But instead of spiraling, I began practicing something new. I would pause, take a breath, name what I was feeling. Not shame, not weakness, grief, anger, relief, strength. Naming things took away their power to ambush me. One afternoon, my lawyer called, not with news, but with closure. The final paperwork had gone through. Everything was settled, legally, officially, permanently. When I hung up, I didn't cry, I didn't celebrate, I just sat there feeling the weight of completion settle into my bones. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Later that evening, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen sink watching the sky darken. I thought about the version of myself who first suspected something was wrong, the woman who ignored her instincts because she didn't want to seem difficult. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her this: you weren't imagining it, you weren't too much, and you weren't wrong to expect honesty from the people who claim to love you. But healing doesn't work that way. You can't rescue your past self. You can only honor her by doing better for the present one. I began volunteering at the community center twice a week. Nothing dramatic. I helped organize paperwork, poured coffee, listened. People told me stories without knowing how much I understood. There's a particular look people get when they've been betrayed, a carefulness around joy, as if happiness might cost them something later. I recognized it immediately. Sometimes I'd say, "You're allowed to take up space." Sometimes I'd say nothing at all and just listen. Both mattered. One evening after a long day, I sat on the porch and realized something else had changed. I was no longer rehearsing defenses in my head, no longer bracing for accusations that never came. My nervous system, so used to being on alert, was learning what safety felt like again. Safety isn't silence, it's knowing you don't have to explain your worth. I didn't forgive Harold in the way people like to talk about forgiveness. There was no ceremonial release, no spiritual breakthrough. I simply stopped carrying the burden of trying to make sense of his choices. Forgiveness for me looked like this: I let his actions belong to him, and I let my life belong to me. Some nights, memories still surfaced, not just the betrayal, but the good years too. The laughter, the ordinary evenings, the version of us that once existed. I let those memories pass through me without arguing with them. Love and betrayal can exist in the same story. Pretending otherwise only fractures you further. I learned that healing isn't about choosing one truth over another. It's about holding all of them without losing yourself. As weeks turned into months, people stopped asking questions. The story lost its shine. Another scandal took its place, another headline, another rumor. But inside my home, something steady had rooted. I trusted myself again. That trust changed everything. I trusted myself to notice red flags. I trusted myself to leave conversations that felt wrong.
I trusted myself to say yes to joy without fearing punishment. And most of all, I trusted myself to protect my own dignity, no matter who disapproved. One morning, as I locked the front door before heading out, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked older, softer in some places, stronger in others. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was pretending anymore. Healing didn't give me my old life back. It gave me a truer one. And that, I've learned, is worth everything.
After the story ended, the way stories do, with doors closing and chapters labeled final, life continued in quieter, less dramatic ways. That part doesn't get talked about much. People think the courtroom is the climax, the proof, the victory. But the truth is, the real work begins after no one is watching anymore. It begins when you wake up on an ordinary Tuesday and realize there's no crisis waiting for you, no adrenaline to carry you through the day, just you, your coffee, and the responsibility of deciding who you are now that survival mode is ended. That adjustment took time. For months, my body still reacted as if danger might return at any moment. A knock at the door made my shoulders tense. An unfamiliar number on my phone made my stomach tighten. Even good news felt suspicious, like a trick I hadn't learned how to spot yet. Trauma doesn't disappear just because justice shows up. So I learned to move slowly. I gave myself permission to rest without guilt, to say no without explanation, to leave conversations when my chest felt heavy instead of forcing myself to endure out of politeness. That was new for me, and uncomfortable, and necessary. One afternoon while organizing old paperwork, I found a photograph I'd forgotten about, Harold and me, years ago, sitting on the porch with mismatched mugs. I was laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from feeling safe. For a moment, grief rose sharp and fast, but then something else followed. Compassion, not for him, for myself, for the woman in that photo who loved fully, trusted deeply, and believed honesty was the foundation of marriage. She wasn't foolish, she was brave. She showed up with her whole heart in a world that doesn't always reward that. I placed the photo back in the box, not with bitterness, but with respect. I didn't lose those years. I lived them. That distinction matters. As time passed, I noticed my voice had changed, not in volume, but in certainty. I no longer softened my words to make them easier for others to digest. I spoke plainly, kindly, firmly. People responded differently. Some leaned in, relieved to meet someone grounded in truth. Others drifted away, uncomfortable with the absence of control. I let both happen. Not everyone is meant to stay. There's a quiet power in realizing you don't need to convince anyone of your reality. Proof is for courtrooms. Peace is for living rooms. I began mentoring younger women through the community center, women navigating divorces, inheritances, family conflicts that felt too heavy to carry alone. They'd ask me how I stayed calm, how I didn't crumble. I always told them the same thing. I did crumble, just not where everyone could see it. Strength isn't the absence of pain. It's choosing not to let pain decide your future. Some nights I still talk to Harold, not out loud, but in my thoughts. Not in anger, not in longing, just acknowledgement. What we were, what we weren't, what could never be again. Closure doesn't require a response. It requires acceptance. And acceptance, I learned, is not agreement. It's simply releasing the fight with reality. I stopped asking why a long time ago. Why invites endless explanations that change nothing. Instead, I focused on what now. What now looks like morning walks without rushing. It looks like friendships rooted in mutual respect. It looks like laughter that doesn't feel borrowed or temporary. It looks like a life that belongs to me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with that golden quiet, I sat with my hands folded and felt something I hadn't felt in years.
contentment. Not excitement, not triumph, contentment. The kind that settles in your chest when you no longer owe anyone silence, sacrifice, or self-erasure. If you're listening to this story and wondering whether speaking up is worth the cost, let me tell you something gently from someone who stood exactly where you might be standing now. Silence has a cost too. It just charges you slowly. Truth may disrupt the room, but it restores the soul. And if my story teaches anything at all, let it be this. You don't have to scream to be powerful. You don't have to destroy to defend yourself. And you don't have to disappear to keep the peace. Sometimes all it takes is standing up, calmly, clearly, and unapologetically, and saying, "This is mine. This is the truth, and I will not be erased." That choice changed my life. And maybe, just maybe, it can change yours too.
There's a quiet moment that comes after everything has been said and done, after the courtroom's empty, after the papers are signed, after the people who watched your pain decide it's time to move on. It's just you then. And in that quiet, I learned something I wish someone had told me earlier in my life. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like finally standing straight again. For a long time, I thought dignity was something you preserved by staying silent, by being polite, by not making waves. I thought strength meant swallowing pain so others could stay comfortable. But real strength, the kind that heals, comes from telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. Pulling out that will in court wasn't about humiliating anyone. It wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to let my life be rewritten by lies. It was about honoring the years I lived honestly, the love I gave freely, and the self-respect I almost lost trying to be understanding. I didn't walk away untouched. Betrayal leaves marks you don't always see, but it also leaves behind clarity. I now know this for sure. If someone benefits from your silence, they will call it peace. If someone fears your truth, they will call it trouble. But your truth is not trouble, and your boundaries are not cruelty. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, being pushed aside, written out, underestimated, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to protect what's yours. You are allowed to ask questions, and you are allowed to take up space in your own story. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering who you were before someone convinced you to shrink. So I'll leave you with this question, the same one I asked myself when it was all over. If you had proof in your hands and dignity on the line, would you stay quiet or would you stand up? Tell me in the comments. I read them more than you know. And if stories like this speak to you, stories about truth, justice, and finding yourself again, please subscribe and stay with me. We're healing one honest story at a time. There's a kind of silence that only comes after a storm has passed and the ground has settled. Not the awkward silence of things left unsaid, but the earned quiet of truth finally having its place. That's where I found myself months later. Life had softened around the edges. Not perfect, not painless, just honest. I no longer woke up thinking about courtrooms or documents or who believed what. Those things lost their urgency the moment I stopped letting them define me. Instead, my days filled with smaller, steadier moments, the kind you don't post about, but the kind that hold you together. Morning sunlight across the kitchen counter, the low hum of the refrigerator, the comfort of knowing I wasn't bracing for betrayal anymore. I realized then how much of my life had been spent anticipating loss rather than living presence, always preparing for disappointment, always smoothing things over before they broke. That habit didn't disappear overnight, but awareness gave me choice, and choice gave me freedom. One afternoon, I ran into someone who knew everything, every detail, every rumor, every dramatic retelling.
She looked at me with curiosity, as if waiting for bitterness or regret. Instead, I smiled. Not a performance smile, a real one. She seemed confused by that. People often are when you refuse to carry the emotions they expect you to. I've learned that healing doesn't always look like strength to outsiders. Sometimes it looks like peace, and peace can be unsettling to those who thrive on chaos. There were still lessons unfolding quietly. I learned how often women are taught to sacrifice clarity for harmony, how we're praised for endurance even when it costs us our sense of self, how standing up for what's right is often labeled as difficult when it comes from someone who is expected to stay agreeable. I stopped accepting that label. Being difficult to deceive is not a flaw. Being hard to erase is not arrogance. It's survival refined into wisdom. I also learned something humbling, that justice doesn't always change people. Sometimes it only reveals them more clearly. Some apologized, some didn't. Some rewrote the story to protect their pride. I let them. Everyone needs a version of events they can live with. Mine didn't require lies. As the year turned, I found myself thinking less about what I'd lost and more about what I'd gained. My voice, my discernment, my sense of worth independent of anyone else's validation. Those things don't come cheap. They're forged in moments you wouldn't wish on anyone, but they last. I started journaling again, not to document pain, but to track growth. I wrote down moments when I spoke up without fear, when I rested without guilt, when I chose myself without apology. Reading those entries back felt like meeting someone new and realizing she had been inside me all along. Occasionally, someone would say, "You're so strong." I always paused at that. Strength didn't feel like the right word. Clarity did. Clarity about what I deserve. Clarity about what I will no longer tolerate. Clarity about how love should feel. Safe, honest, mutual. If you're still listening, still holding on to this story, maybe it's because something in it echoes your own life. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe your truth has been questioned. Maybe you've been told to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Let me say this gently and without drama. Peace built on silence is fragile. Peace built on truth can carry you through anything. You don't need a courtroom moment to reclaim yourself. You don't need proof in your hands to know your worth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Your life does not require their permission. If my story leaves you with anything at all, I hope it's this quiet reassurance. You are allowed to protect your legacy. You are allowed to speak when it matters. And you are allowed to walk away whole. I did. And every day since, I wake up knowing this: nothing was taken from me in the end. What mattered most, I kept.